Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're just going to wait a couple minutes before we get started for more folks to trickle in. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to wait a couple minutes before getting started to let a few more guests trickle in. We'll be right with you. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the City of Yes for Housing Opportunities Zoning Practitioners Forum. We're excited to speak with you today about our new text amendment, and I am going to turn it to Director Gorodnik to kick us off.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Gorodnik, Chair of the City Planning Commission and Director of the Department of City Planning. Thanks to all of you for attending our City of Yes for Housing Opportunity Practitioner Forum. We are very happy that you're spending some of your afternoon with us. We've got a lot to cover today. As you all know, City of Yes is the single most pro-housing zoning plan in New York City's history. Over the next 15 years, we expect that it will enable 82,000 new homes, and that is more than all of the neighborhood rezonings from 12 years of Mayor Bloomberg, and double those that were delivered by Mayor de Blasio, and of course does not even account for our own neighborhood planning efforts that are already adopted and underway. But of course, the city won't be building 82,000 homes on its own. So that's why we're here, and that's where you all obviously come in. You all play the most important role in the city at this point, digging into the rules to actually build the housing that New Yorkers need. Now, we all know that things can take a while to get done in New York City, but thankfully, that does not apply to zoning text amendments once they are adopted. City of Yes for Housing Opportunity went into effect the moment that the City Council approved it on December the 5th. So that means right now it is legal once again to build missing middle apartment buildings. Right now, non-residential conversions are allowed citywide. Right now, we can map high-density zoning districts with FARs of 15 and 18, just like we are proposing in our Midtown South MSMX neighborhood plan. And right now, parking mandates have been eliminated for 2.6 million people across New York City, which, by the way, is the largest mandate-free area in all of the United States. So more people in New York City now live in an area without parking mandates than any other area in the United States. So there's a lot more in there, obviously, so many other important changes, whether it's our universal affordability preference, standardizing and lowering the dwelling unit factor, allowing more contextual infill, replacing the sliver law, and much more. So needless to say, there's a lot to unpack here, and that's where this session comes in. With City of Yes now in effect, it's crucial to connect with developers, lawyers, architects, all of you, practitioners who are going to turn these changes into shovels in the ground. So again, thank you so much for being here today. We'll have time for Q&A. We encourage you to stay in touch. Our team is here to support you as we bring this really important initiative to life. And so with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to turn it over to Frank and Chris. Gentlemen, take it away.
Thanks, Dan. So maybe I'll Alex, if okay, I'll do a little housekeeping on the questions Q&A part. We've got the chat open for questions, and we're going to do our best as we're going through the presentation to make sure that we are able to answer any questions. And then at the end, as we go through these, after we go through this, we'll open it up to a more sort of larger Q&A and make sure we get to every question that we see in the chat and any others that you have. I guess I should actually just introduce myself. I'm Frank Rashala. I'm the zoning director here at City Planning. Chris, who is the deputy director, is also going to be helping give this presentation. And we've got John Manjin, our housing director, actually sort of running the Q&A on the other side of the Zoom call. So let me start. One of the things that after City of Yes housing opportunity got approved, we actually got a call from DOB, and DOB was like, it would be really good if you could give us a presentation of what is in housing opportunity, but do it in a way that's sort of like, where is it in the zoning? And that actually kind of caused us to have to put together a presentation that's a little different than the normal kinds of presentations we do at the department. But we found it was helpful, and we hope it is helpful for you all, to sort of have to go through it in those ways, because you sort of start seeing where things are. And because there's been so much zoning change in this project and in others, it's sort of helpful to see it that way. So we're going to try to do that today for all of the elements of housing opportunity. So housing opportunity is the third of the three City of Yes text amendments. Lots of zoning changes over the last year. You all are probably trying to get used to that yourselves. We are all still trying to get used to that ourselves. There are still times we're realizing, oh, wow, the rules really are a little bit different. Then even, seeing it all in one place really makes a very different zoning resolution. Housing opportunity, as just for make sure that everyone has some sort of stage setting. The housing opportunity text amendment was intended to be citywide and really think about the ways that zoning impacted housing production in all of the different parts of the city, not looking at any individual neighborhood, but looking at the city overall in all of its densities and all of its various zoning districts. What that meant is it produced the biggest text amendment essentially since 1961. It's about 1,400 pages if you had to print it out. It took the title of biggest text amendment from economic opportunity, which got passed 6 months before it, really speaking to the change that's been happening over the last year. And even though there are 1,400 pages here, for the most part, about a quarter, give or take, really were concentrated in residential bulk. And so that's going to be, some people will call that Article 2, Chapter 3. We're probably, just as we're going to talk about this as we go through this, we're just going to call it 23, right? That is the chapter where much of this will be located, and we'll try to make sure that we're highlighting that as we go. The other thing I'd say just early on, just to make sure that everyone is aware, now a couple months after approval, the online ZR is now fully updated. So you can go through the ZR as it is approved with carbon neutrality, economic opportunity, and housing opportunity all together in a single place. So that should, that early time after approval is always a little tough, but now we're sort of past that. The way we'll talk about stuff today is we try to use the sort of presentation structure that often you would, if you were seeing a presentation of housing opportunity. Sometimes we have to make some changes just to be able to focus on some of the more specific zoning things. But generally we'll go through it. I'll start with lower density changes. Chris will jump in to do medium and high density changes. I'll come back in to do parking, which sort of had effects across all zoning districts. And then Chris will look at some other citywide changes that affected not just R1s or R5 up to R5s, but R1s all the way up. So one thing before we sort of jump into any individual aspect that we've found, we actually often would have this slide in the back of a presentation. We've been giving this to like our own internal staff, other agencies. And we'd always have this in the back and people would say, it's actually really helpful. Could you have, it'd be nice if you told us that in the beginning, because it helps maybe organize people as they're thinking about what they're seeing. Is Article 2, Chapter 3, and how it was reorganized, right? So if it is the place where most residential bulk rules exist in the zoning resolution, it was going to be the area that saw the greatest effect. And because of that, we took the opportunity to try to take what is probably what was one of the more disorganized chapters of the zoning resolution and try to give it a little bit more order that made sense. And to some degree, we were trying to think of as practitioners, right? So we really thought about organizing the chapter as if you were building a building, right? So you start with 2310, and those are going to be all your lot size rules. How big of a lot do I need to actually build a building? When you have that established, you move into floor area. How much can I actually build? 2330 is going to be all the rules about yards, courts, distance between buildings, coverage, the things that establish essentially where the building can locate on the lot. Then we're going to start moving up in 3 dimensions in 2340. That's going to be height and setback. And now we're going to go into the building. 2350 is going to deal with things like density. How many units are you allowed to have? And then further, even though we often say zoning doesn't typically deal with design aspects of a building, 2360 is where it actually does sometimes, right? So things like recreation space, things like balconies, things like our street trees. Those elements will be in 2360. And then finally, sort of aspects of residential bulk that didn't really make sense in any specific area because they were really particular to some geographies. They wound up in the back in 2370. So that's where you'll find your predominantly built up area rules, if you know them. Your height factor zoning rules all are going to be in the back there. 27, which is a new chapter, is going to be where all of the rules of administration of all of the affordable housing aspects of the zoning are moved out of residential bulk to like let residential bulk be about bulk, and then move those to 27. And then finally, 28, which had been quality housing, would often played a big role with a lot of residential bulk rules. Those rules are now essentially in 23, so there was no longer a need for that chapter in 28. So hopefully, as practitioners, finding things in this chapter and finding these rules will be easier. We've, I think, hoped and I think we found it that way as we've been going through it, but it will take us all some time to get used to. All right, so I'm going to jump into low density. First, just for table setting, the general idea of the changes for low density districts. And again, just for everyone's sake, when I'm saying low density, I'm meaning R1 through R5 districts. The overall idea was, let's make sure that as a first step, zoning can allow the types of buildings that zoning says it allows in low density districts. Right. So there are often times where you're saying you have an allowance for a 2-family, you're in a 2-family zoning district, but it's actually really hard to make a 2-family building work on the lot, either because of parking or low FAR or density factors, even to some degrees. And so that was sort of always an odd thing. There were definitely situations where the zoning actually wouldn't allow things like small apartment buildings or accessory dwelling units, even though those were things like often apartment buildings you'd find in low density neighborhoods, but the zoning sort of wasn't really built with it in mind. So this comes down to like 2 types of changes. One are what we would call and what we often would call in presentations was district fixes. And what that was trying to do is get the zoning that's on the map in line. And then the second group, which we'll talk about in a second after that, trying to allow some new things. So we'll start with the district fixes. So district fixes looked to really sort of take a hard look at all of the residential bulk rules for low density districts. I think one of the things that we found over time are that even though as districts, they were often designed to promote building forms like you would see in our low density neighborhoods, they were often a little off. And I think like you would often see examples where one building existed in the neighborhood for 50 years, and you're trying to build a building similar to it next door. And you'd either have yards that are required to be a bit wider, you have FARs that are a little bit lower. And what that often meant was the existing buildings would happen to be non-compliant because all of a sudden the zoning they had to live with actually said they couldn't be built like that. So that could be a problem for a homeowner. B, it meant that if you're building a new building, it actually didn't exactly match what was around. And it often meant that like places where the zoning would say you could do a 2-family or you could do a small multifamily building, it actually would be really, really hard to do. And so what you instead see is a lot of single family houses being constructed because all the rules of zoning would sort of jump on the site and kind of make it all but impossible to do the thing that one side of the zoning actually says you could do. The other thing that was really trying to acknowledge, and I think this is something we've tried to acknowledge over time, is while we all hope and sort of try to design our zoning rules based on nice rectangular, perfect, 25 by 100 lots, the reality is sites are a lot more complicated. And so over time, we've tried to acknowledge narrow lots, shallow lots, weird topography, in a way that we've done over time more in the higher density districts, and we wanted to take this opportunity to bring down to the lower density districts too. So what are those kinds of things that happened in low density districts? So two just sort of bigger ticket items that people often sort of think about. One is minimum lot size, right? So if you have a large lot and you are trying to build and you're trying to figure out how many units you could build on the lot or subdivide it, you would see that our low density districts had many, many different flavors of minimum lot sizes, depending on the zoning district. And they're all slightly different, all trying to accomplish different things. But one of the things I think we looked at over time is when you looked at the lots that actually were on the ground in the city's neighborhoods, they all sort of were pretty similar. They all, the general lot in New York City is 25 by 100, and that's true in low density neighborhoods just as much as it is true in other neighborhoods. And we wanted to try to address that inconsistency in the zoning by trying to simplify the minimum lot sizes in low density districts, trying to get as many of them as possible to be closer to that 25-foot minimum lot width, minimum lot area of around that same 2,375 feet. Some districts are a little bit wider than that. But generally trying to make these more in line and also just generally smaller than they would have been before CHO. The other thing, big ticket item that often comes up was floor area ratio. So in different low density districts, the typical concept was, in an R1, R2, R3 district, the max FAR was going to be a 0.5. When you got to R4s, it was going to be like a 0.75. R5s, like a 1.25. And sometimes there would be things that would get you a little higher, whether that be an attic bonus, whether that be predominantly built up area rules. And one of the things that I think we sort of wanted to try to do is sort of simplify this and actually just make a singular FAR that would be higher, but that would kind of get us out of the need to like have all of these different particular FAR increases. That would just allow everyone the ability to build something more. And that I think what that manifests to is that, in your typical R1 through R3 districts, you're now going to have a maximum FAR of 0.75. R4s are going to go up to 1, and R5s generally go up to 1.5. There are some conditions that exist in the lower density districts when you have larger lots that sort of act as a limit to the 0.75. But generally that becomes those numbers become the new starting point of floor area. But knowing that districts have dozens of rules that really were applying to them, there were a lot of changes, and many of the changes in residential bulk were dealing with all of these kinds of things. So 2311 is where you're going to find those lot area and lot width rules that I just showed that little chart. Floor area is going to be in 2321. 23, then we're going to have changes that go into various particular issues with all of our yards, our front yards, side yards, rear yards, and then relatedly coverages, distance between buildings, all those things that sort of like locate the building, trying to make it easier to often match neighbors, right? There are times where neighbor buildings would actually be more forward than the zoning would allow, and your building that you're constructing is required to be further back. We want to try to address stuff like that, try to get side yards to be more in line with what older buildings had. Rear yards also, like often buildings built before 1961 had shallower rear yards than the buildings after 1961 because the zoning required 30 feet. And so now, for example, if you're doing a detached house, your rear yard is allowed to be back to 20 feet. If your lot's wider than 40 feet, regardless of whether it's detached, semi-detached, or even sort of apartment buildings, it can now be, again, 20 feet also. Coverage changes have to be in line with all those different changes. Couple other things, some of the envelopes, I'll just jump to in height and setback, 2342. Tried to simplify the pitched roof envelope that some people sort of know about, where some started at 21 feet, some started at 25, trying to simplify that. Trying to give a flat roof envelope when you were doing multifamily housing. That was always an odd issue in some zoning districts, that like you had to do a building form which was for like a single or two family house, even though you were actually trying to do apartments. Density controls. One thing that is important to remind or to remember was the zoning would get very weirdly persnickety about density and like numbers of units in low density districts, which often meant even though the zoning would say you could do a two-family house on that minimum lot size, there'd be this other rule that would come in and say, well, it actually has to be 5-10 feet wider. We tried to get rid of that and just essentially say when you're doing single or two family residences, which are allowed as uses in some districts, you don't have a density factor anymore. You just have the use. If you're doing apartment buildings, regardless of the zoning districts, you're back to a density factor of 680, which is a little different from what it would have been previous to CHO. And then really loving in front yard planting. It was very complicated and there were differences between different zoning districts. Tried to just simplify that in the design rules of 2360s. So it's a lot of different changes. Now let's talk about changes about some more particular topics. So if those were things that you could have done already, right? You could do a two-family house in a two-family district. The next two are going to be things that you couldn't have done before, but we wanted to make sure you had the opportunity through CHO. So one of the first ones was qualifying residential sites. So in presentations, if you saw people giving presentations about CHO during public review, you'd often hear this called town center or TOD. In the zoning itself, the zoning gets to use less cool terms like qualifying residential site. And these are the rules that allow sites that meet certain criteria access to multifamily housing, regardless of the zoning district, higher FARs, different envelopes, parking, which we'll talk about later, but give them the ability to essentially do small apartment buildings like you would see in many existing low density neighborhoods, but the zoning wouldn't always really permit. even in the places where it allowed multifamily housing, not at the scale of buildings that you'd often just see walking around in older neighborhoods. So there's really two flavors of this. If you are in an R3 through R5 district, so these are going to be your 2-family and multifamily low density districts, you can gain access to being a qualifying residential site. If you're in the greater transit zone, so that's going to be what's shown here on the map, the blue portions. If you're on a lot that's at least 5,000 square feet, right? Because apartment buildings tended to be on lots that were a little bigger than maybe their neighbors. And if you're located on a wide street or the short end of a block on a narrow street. And the idea of those is like when you sort of walked around neighborhoods, those are actually the places the apartment buildings would tend to be in older, low density parts of the city. That's sort of the first version of qualifying residential site. There's a second version for sites with existing community facility uses. And this is a little bit more permissive geographically. First note, it's available for sites in R1 through R5 districts. So that means single family, 2-family, and multifamily districts. Here, you are able to do it if you're in the greater transit zone, sort of that area in blue, on any lot size, on any location, and the area beyond the greater transit zone. So let's say there's areas more in gray. You can do it as long as the lot is 5,000 square feet. So more permissive generally, considering that those sites have existing community facilities. So what does that mean? So two of the biggest changes, just to kind of try to bring it home. First is, I'll start from the envelope perspective. You get a flat roof envelope. You get a envelope designed to fit the floor area that you were permitted. So in the R1 through R3 districts, you'll get a flat 35-foot envelope. In the R4 districts, you'll get a sort of essentially flat 45-foot envelope. In the R5 districts, you get a flat 55-foot envelope. It sort of works nice and easy. And the other thing, and sort of the bigger deal, is you get a slightly increased floor area ratio. So, if you have a regular standard zoning lot in a, let's say, R3-ish district, your standard FAR is going to be 0.75, but a qualifying residential site is able to go up to 1.0, right? So a little bit of a difference, more in line with like the apartment buildings that we would see in neighborhoods. Is sort of like the older buildings, like they were always a little bit bigger on lots that were a little bit bigger than typical housing. And we want to try to reflect that. So that same sort of jump is reflected. The R4s generally are about 0.5 higher. The R5s generally also about 0.5 higher. So some of the key rules for these are going to be found as a first pass in definitions. So you're actually not going to be in the residential bulk chapter. You're going to be in defined terms in 1210. That's going to tell you, are you in the greater transit zone? First of all, are you in those locations where the different sort of, you could begin to have access to these rules at different site sizes and different configurations. More importantly, 1210 is qualifying residential sites. So this has all of the applicability, those things about the lot sizes, short ends of the block, things like that. So it's going to be one of the key locations here. I saw just a question on the 0.6 to 0.75. I went through it before, but we can go back to it at some point during the Q&A or while we're answering. You get residential uses that are more permissive. So if you're in a 2-family district, you are allowed multifamily housing if you're a qualifying residential site. You get that higher floor area. We showed the chart. A little bit different side yard rules, just trying to align with neighbors. And you get that envelope. One thing I should say, and actually it sort of comes up sometimes. One of the other things that is, if you are on a large site, gaining access to qualifying residential site. And in the zoning, this is going to be sites that are can generate more than 50,000 square feet of residential floor area. There is going to be a condition of affordability to gain access to the full FAR I was showing for qualifying residential site. It's a little different than UAP, which is something that sort of more has applicability in R6 through R10 districts. But there is a provision in there in the qualifying residential site defined term that talks about those things. Next, qualifying residential sites when you are in a commercial district. So these are places even in low density neighborhoods where you typically see apartment buildings with ground floor commercial usually below. And that was a form that existed. The zoning pre-4 CHO sort of generally assumed that that was possible. Even in like single family districts, you could do multifamily in a C district. But the zoning really wasn't there to like actually let the building form be there in total. And so what we were trying to do is allow, when you're in a C district, more access to the qualifying residential site rules, just because you are in a commercial district. So again, similarly, it's going to be ideas about locations, greater transit zone is going to be helpful to locate like some rules about this. Qualifying residential site, again, is where the applicability will be. Floor area, as we showed before, those will be there. Height and setback, same as before. Two things that are important and different in commercial districts I should really highlight. If you are in the greater transit zone, regardless of what your underlying residential district was, right? Say you're in an R4 with the C1 or C2 overlay. What this section 34.111 says is if you're in the greater transit zone, don't pay attention to the rules for R4. Instead, look at the rules for an R5. And that tries to better reflect in those areas near transit. On commercial corridors, the buildings often were bigger than they would be further beyond, even in other commercial corridors. Like those areas near transit were a bit denser, and that tries to reflect it that way. The other thing now we're in commercial bulk, particularly for mixed buildings. So we're in 3532. The other thing the zoning does is says, as a way to make sure that a qualifying residential site's higher residential floor area doesn't conflict or compete with non-residential uses, right? Those kinds of ground floors of commercial or maybe even community facilities. It actually says this section says you get a higher overall floor area for the lot, about a half FAR higher than the max residential, reserved essentially for commercial community facility, essentially non-residential uses that are permitted in that location. And that idea is it gives people the ability to do a ground floor and then have that housing actually then above it. It's trying to reflect the building form in a way in the zoning and not have it just be housing fully on the site because of the higher res FAR. Next, the other kind of big piece here is going to be ancillary dwelling units. So this is going to mean that usually most people think about this in places where you have a single or two family house. So that is often going to be an issue, a kind of thing in single or two family zoning districts, but it has applicability beyond that into multifamily low density. And what this does is essentially allows an additional unit on the lot in it beyond that primary residence, say in a single family district, or the two units that are permitted in, say, a two family district. One of the things I think we often try to make clear is the zoning is one aspect of this. There's lots of other laws that like affect ADUs, both from construction codes, other housing regulations, but the zoning is sort of one aspect and one that we could tackle as part of this. What is allowed? Well, what essentially you get if you have a single or two family house is you gain access to a use that is an accessory or an ancillary dwelling unit, having a maximum size of 800 square feet. Some locational rules, has to be at least 5 feet from a lot line, has to be at least 10 feet from structures on the lot. And if it's detached, sort of out in the backyard, has a maximum height of 15 feet, or if there's parking below it, a maximum height of 25 feet. One of the things that we acknowledge often in the New York City context is ancillary dwelling units will take a variety of forms in New York City because our lot sizes are smaller, our buildings are different. Whereas in many other cities in the US, you often find them in the backyards because backyards are enormous compared to ours. We're aware that like attics, attachments, basements may be as possible locations for ADUs than the typical what sort of other parts of the country think of as the backyard kind of house. So the zoning tries to acknowledge that and be open and think about all of those different types and make sure that we're sort of thinking about those coherently. So there are locational and sort of other rules that kind of play into this, given that there are these different types. So one, just as a starting point, is at the initial occupancy of the ancillary dwelling unit, there's a requirement that the homeowner live on the property. The idea of that is it sort of ensures that there is a homeowner as part of the overall lot. Over time, that changes to make sure that tenancy can evolve and sort of not forcing people to move the moment an owner changes. There are locational restrictions that also come into play. So number one, no ancillary dwelling units in any of the coastal risk districts. Those are kind of the very particular special purpose districts we have. Hamilton Beach is one, a couple others in the city on the coast. There are no subgrade ADUs in coastal and inland flood zones. So it's a little different. It's not just the 100-year, it's not the sort of coastal floodplain. It's also inland flooding areas too. And for detached, this sort of backyard ADU concept, there are also locational restrictions there too. One, coastal and inland floodplains similarly. Some particular zoning districts, when they are beyond the greater transit zone, historic districts, and portions of the special Bay Ridge district. It's kind of some very particular things here, but in total, there still is a much broader ability to do ancillary dwellings than ever before in the city. So where are these things going to be located in the zoning? Number one, as a use, is first defined in 1210, the definition, ancillary dwelling unit. That's going to give you all of those geographic limitations are going to be located there. There's a sort of sibling definition of backyard ancillary dwelling, which is going to be important for some of those more particular geographic limits. Just to give single and two family residents, it makes clear that they are allowed to have that second unit or that third unit, even if you are supposed to only have one or two residences on the lot. Lots of rules about permitted obstructions, particularly in the rear yard. For backyard ADUs in residential bulk in the yard section, and then some things about distance between buildings to make sure that there is separation. If there is separation between let's say a primary residence and the ADU, that they be at least 10 feet apart. So that is a lot on low density. And we're just going to jump right into medium and high density, which is a sort of different aspect of the project, but also kind of has that same framework of focus on district fixes and then other particulars. Chris?
Hi, everyone. So I'll walk through medium and high density districts. I should start off by saying that I'm fighting a cold, so I apologize if I sound stuffed up. I've broken this up similar to Frank's. It starts with district fixes, and then we go into some of the more core components of the medium and high density program. Next slide.
Oh, yeah.
So in terms of district fixes, I've broken these into three different groupings. There's a group of changes that support better unit design and configuration. There's a grouping of things that we did to remove antiquated or exclusionary rules. And then there's a third grouping that we made changes to better reflect specific context. I would say the medium and high density changes, the district fixes here aren't as sweeping, but there are some neat stuff within them. Next slide. So Frank touched on this a little bit, but it's probably more prevalent in medium and high density districts. And these are changes to support better unit layouts that are starting with, I kind of think of them as all stemming from the rear yard. And one thing that we really noticed a lot is that our rules are really great in sort of mimicking the sort of scale of existing neighborhoods, but they weren't really completely mimicking the form. And oftentimes when we actually, sneak into the backyard via Google Maps, we could find all these great pre-war apartments that had, these really deep buildings, but they had these great courtyards within them. And that courtyard that they had within those shallow yards provided really great units. It allowed for multiple frontages. It allowed for cross ventilation, more light and air. And so even though it seemed a little bit counterintuitive, the older rules with the shallower yards actually were facilitating better unit design sometimes. So we wanted to make that change and allow people to build great buildings again, that could bring more light and air into their apartment units. So the first change to that was to the rear yard itself. And we said the minimum dimension up to a height of 75 feet can be reduced now from 30 to 20 feet. These are going to apply on lots that are at least 40 feet wide. This was a change we made, sort of just to preclude the most, bad actors that were, we weren't really intending this to mimic the tenement buildings from the 1800s with the railroad apartments. This was really trying to bring back, some of the great pre-war buildings of the 1930s and 40s that had the deeper courtyards, and great exposures to light and air. So with the rear yard change made, there's a series of other changes that we made that were sort of, I think of them as sort of dominoing from that critical dimension. We also modified the distance for minimum dimensions of courts, the minimum dimensions from legal windows to lot lines. We mirrored the minimum dimension of a rear yard into a minimum rear yard equivalent. And then we also baked these new changes into the maximum interior lot coverages. Next slide. So this is kind of looking where these sections are located. This is kind of a big change, and if you're really nerdy like us, you might get excited that now all of these regulations are in sequential order. They used to be kind of scattered all over 2300. So now you have your rear yard requirements, your rear yard equivalent requirements, and then you jump right to court regulations. You don't have to jump all the way to 2380 anymore. They're right next door to each other. And then you have maximum lot coverage. This was previously in 2315. And then after that, you have minimum distance between buildings and then minimum distance between buildings or windows and lot lines. Next. Okay, the second change to support better unit configuration is more internal, and this is sort of the unit mix. And this is a change to dwelling unit factor. Frank touched on this a lot in the outer boroughs, and the big changes there, moving the minimum dwelling unit factor down to 680. The changes that I want to highlight are more places where we removed dwelling unit factor altogether. So you could, going forward, have a development or enlargement with exclusively studio apartments. Now that's going to be applicable in what we call a special density area. It's, kind of an annoying zoning term, but it correlates to that lavender area on the map that is the Manhattan core and the special downtown Brooklyn district. So in these locations going forward, new buildings are not subject to a dwelling unit factor. Besides the new developments and enlargements, we also were able to liberalize the dwelling unit factor for conversions. So in that same lavender geography, there's no dwelling unit factor if you convert any non-residential building to residences. And then beyond that, there's no dwelling unit factor if you convert to a community facility, from a community facility to a residence. Next. These regulations are pretty targeted. They're in 2351, 2352. Okay, the next grouping of district fixes are amendments that we made to remove antiquated or exclusionary rules. And these are a smattering of things, but I want to highlight probably one that you're all familiar with and kind of encapsulates how zoning can change over time, and something that was well-intended can actually become an impediment to housing production. And that's the sliver law. So sliver law was created in the 1980s when height factor buildings were really the only game in town. And it was put in place in reaction to some out of context buildings that were coming up on the mid blocks. And it's a very pragmatic and rational rule, but it made sense in the context of there being no height limits really other than the sky exposure plane. You fast forward 40, 50 years, and much of the city now actually has height regulations. Many of these areas are contextual districts that have a very specific height regulation dictated in the zoning resolution. And the sliver law actually oftentimes was lower than that maximum height limit. So it was oftentimes serving as an impediment to maximizing one's permitted development rights. So that's something that we thought, well, if you have a height limit in a district, you shouldn't have to be subject to sliver law anymore. You have a height limit built into your district. So that's kind of an encapsulation. But besides sliver law, there were several other places that, some more intentionally than others, artificially suppressed FARs or suppressed the overall height limit of a building. And oftentimes when we encountered those, we tried to remove those and just allow the underlying district regulations to apply. Next slide. So to give you a sense of some of the things that we removed, there were artificially suppressed FARs in old section 23153 that pulled down the maximum FARs for R6, R7, and R8 districts on wide streets and Manhattan core. It's sort of counterintuitive. That's where you would want, more density, not less density. So we removed that. There were special FARs in Community District 7 in Manhattan, special heights in Community District 7 in Manhattan. I mentioned that we removed sliver law when you are using standard height and setback rules. And then there's also various special districts where there was similar flavors of rules existing. A couple things that are still in place. So limited height districts are still in place. One caveat to that is that buildings with affordable housing can now exceed limited height district height regulations. And then if you are going to use the sky exposure plane building regulations or the old height factor building regulations, sliver will still apply to you. That will be in 23738. Next. Okay, the last grouping of district fixes are changes to better reflect certain contexts. The first part of these is talking about street wall. And the street wall regulations in our medium and high density districts, we're generally pretty happy with. We think they generally reflect a lot of the neighborhoods that they're put in place with. But we did want to make a couple targeted changes to them. And they're just kind of reflect our understanding of these rules over time and some quirks that we've realized and things that that weren't intended and that we want to rectify. The first of them deals with lineup rules. And our lineup rules make a lot of sense when you think of them in the context of, a Manhattan mid-block, and you think of, row houses marching down the street. The quirk to them was that the last 30 years, they've also applied to non-contextual districts on narrow streets. And so you have situations in the outer boroughs where you might be an R6 district and you actually have to line up with and not be closer nor further to your neighbor, and your neighbor is a single family home. And that's just sort of an example of an unintended consequence that we wanted to remove. So we took non-contextual districts out of the lineup rules and just applied the percentage-based rules, the sort of standard 70% of the street wall should be located within 8 feet of the street line or something like that. The other thing that we realized is that a lot of these rules are working fairly well, but there's always oddball blocks. And you might have a situation where even though you have a pretty loose rule, like a 70% within 8 feet, the entire block might be set back 10 feet. And so even if you wanted to be a good neighbor and line up with them, you couldn't. The rule wouldn't let you. So we created a term called a prevailing street wall lineup or prevailing character. And that allows one to modify themselves based on their specific context. And there's a way that it works, whether you're subject to lineup rules and you need more relaxation, or whether you're subject to percentage-based rules and you need more relaxation. Besides these two general changes, we also were looking at sort of edge case scenarios and places where, no matter what, you probably could use some street wall relief. The first of those were just large zoning lots. So zoning lots that are half a block, 40,000 square feet. We wanted to loosen the street wall rules there because you're sort of establishing your own character at that point. You are half the block at that point. So you should probably be able to dictate a little bit more of what the character is. Second, if you are a transportation infrastructure adjacent frontage, if you're next to a rail line, if you're next to a highway, we don't really want to force anyone to have to be close to that sort of nuisance. So we liberalize the rules so that they can set back further. And then the third thing was in historic districts. There's a few instances where we've already allowed this, where we allow your minimum base height and your maximum base height to change to match your neighbor. These are good things. They're historic buildings. You should be able to match them. So we made that the underlying rule. Next. And then beyond street wall into just general height and setback rules, we also made some changes. The first change is particular to non-contextual districts, and this is a thing we thought about quite a bit, and you'll see it in the next slide as well. We created a term called eligible sites, and there's three different criteria generally of what makes you eligible to use the eligible site rules. The first element of them is you have to be on an irregular site. So if you're a shallow lot and inordinately deep lot, if you have strange geography, if you have steep topography, then you could qualify to use these rules. Or if you're a transportation infrastructure adjacent frontage again, so if you're against a rail line, if you're against a highway, then you are eligible for these rules. And what these rules allow you is to have a much more looser overall maximum height limit in the district than you otherwise would have. And our intention in here is we were thinking long and hard about the situations where the rigidness of the quality housing envelope sort of force people into having to use a height factor building, even when they might necessarily want to, because they are taking a ding for the FAR. They weren't able to use, they wouldn't be able to use UAP. So in the future, we didn't want to preclude that sort of situation. So we were trying to think game out all the scenarios where one might have been pushed into height factor. And these were two of the biggest ones that we saw, that if you had an irregular site or if you were next to some of these transportation infrastructure pieces. So that's the first tool that we created for non-contextual districts. We mirrored a little bit of this in contextual districts, not as extreme, but we did learn from some of our recent special districts, like Jerome Avenue or Inwood, or even the district that predated all of them, the C44L district. And in those places, we kind of used the same tactics to treat elevated rail lines. We dropped the maximum base height, and we just allowed a little bit more 1 or 2 stories of overall height relief. So we deployed that as an option in all contextual districts. So now if you have a site next to an elevated rail line, you don't have to seek a special district to do that or change your zoning. You would have it instantaneously. A couple other things that we did, we changed the underlying tower rules to better reflect just the increasing prevalence of small zoning lots, where the baseline 1961, 40% tower rules weren't working all that well anymore. We tried to align them with lessons learned from downtown Brooklyn or Lower Manhattan that have a looser tower coverage up to a certain height, and then a little bit more stringent one above that height, and made that sort of the baseline rule. So there's a 65% coverage and then a 50% coverage. And then we also adjusted, there's a transition rule between district boundaries between low density districts and high density districts. It applies within 25 feet of the district boundary. We tried to address that a little bit and make it less rigid, as both to accommodate some of the higher density buildings that we're going to be seeing in the low density side, but also new programs like UAP that are going to be completely affordable housing buildings, and we don't want to stifle the development potential in that district boundary area. Next. This is just showing the height table for eligible sites. So this is a separate section from the baseline heights. It's a couple sections later, and you'll see it's just increasing the overall maximum height by 2, 3, 4. It depends on the district, but just an incremental amount of overall height. And it's really just meant to give a lot of flexibility to move the building around and accommodate those difficult situations. Related to this is the third prong of an eligible site, and that is a large site. One of the things that we really wanted to do in this proposal was to allow for more contextual infill and more height relief on large sites. So first off, we eliminated the rules that precluded mixing of contextual buildings on height factor campuses. Next, we added as a third prong of these eligible sites that are over 20,000 square feet, that they're able to use these more flexible height and setback regulations as well. Now on these sites, these larger sites, in exchange for that additional height, there is a lower maximum lot coverage, and that's going to be 65% on interior lots on sites that are 30,000 square feet or more, and then 50% coverage on large sites, which are sites that are 1.5 acres or more. And then similarly, there is a kind of a caution that we didn't want new development to go over existing recreational amenities. So no infill is permitted to go over recreational amenities existing on a residential campus, unless they're replaced in kind. So if you want to move them to another side of the campus, that's totally fine. We just can't eliminate them altogether. These sites will continue to have the rear yard equivalent flexibility that they've always historically had. And then one more caveat is that these sites, the sites that are over 40,000 square feet, are eligible for a penthouse rule. They can exceed the heights in the table if there's an existing building on the site that already exceeds the height of the table, and they'll be able to match that existing building height, provided that that doesn't exceed 25% over the height of the table. Next. So just walking you through where some of these rules are. New terms, large site and prevailing street wall frontage. That was to give the out for some of the street wall rules. They're both 1210 defined terms. The rear yard equivalent rules with the exemptions for large sites or alternative location for eligible sites. They're going to be in 23344. There are special lot coverage rules for eligible sites for the large campus sites. They're in 23362. The street wall location rules, these are 23431. The eligible site rules are moving down a couple sections to 23434. The very next section is the tower regulations with the increased tower coverage. Additional height and setback provisions, these are in 23436. This is where you'll find the base height matching provisions in historic districts. Special tower provisions, this is where we've moved these sort of tower on a base add-ons. They're going to be in 23441. And then another special provisions section in 23443. This is where you'll find the special rules for contextual districts next to elevated rail lines, as well as the special transition heights along district boundaries. And just a note, there's, I'm focusing on the residential rules. There's also, parallels to these in 3563 when you're in a commercial district. Next. Okay, so that was the district fixes. And now we're going to move on to universal affordability preference. This was clearly one of the bigger aspects of the proposal. It is different than MIH in that it is applicable now. You do not need a rezoning to effectuate it. The day that this became adopted, UAP went into place. And if you are not in an MIH area, you are eligible to use it. And this is the really cool aspect of it, is that because it is in place, we don't have to lean so hard on these rezonings to effectuate change. And it really will facilitate, a lot more incremental growth around the city. Next. So to just touch on some of the more bulk aspects of UAP, the first and foremost is the FAR mods. So in exchange for, we've established 2 FARs in our residential district regulations. There is a standard FAR, and then there is an additional FAR for qualifying affordable housing. Within qualifying affordable housing, there is UAP. And also MIH. And generally, this second tier of FAR is about 20% over the standard FAR. Unlike the voluntary program that this is replacing, there is no suppression of the non-affordable FAR. You have just 2 FARs. You have your standard FAR, and then you have the second FAR for qualifying affordable housing. Now, I said it's generally 20%. There's a few instances where it's a little bit more than 20%. And what that's doing is it's acknowledging that some non-contextual districts and some generally R6s and R7s had a pre-existing FAR that exceeded 20% for heirs, for affordable independent residents for seniors. Where that exceeded it, we matched it so that they could all be in alignment, and that qualifying affordable housing and qualifying senior housing can be equivalent generally. Now, second, after we've established those differential FARs, we also continued our practice of allowing additional height when you provide these amenities in the building, just to accommodate the FIR. So generally, you'll see an additional, 1, 2, 3, 4 stories right next to the standard heights in the same table, just off to the side in a separate column. Now, I mentioned that UAP replaces the VIH program. There's special vesting rules for the VIH program. So you can continue to use offsite credits in those locations of the inclusionary housing designated areas program. But going forward, UAP is replacing it. And also it's important to note that MIH is separate and distinct from this. You don't pile your UAP on top of MIH. It is a separate and distinct program. If you're in an MIH area, you don't have access to UAP, and vice versa. Next. Just want to also note a couple changes to the MIH program. First, we allowed as option 3 of the MIH program to be a standalone option. It had previously been required to be mapped along with option 1 or option 2, but now it is allowed to be a standalone option. We tried to equalize MIH FIRs across the board with UAP FIRs, just so to avoid a lot of nightmare and headaches and confusion. So there's a few instances where MIH FIRs just went up a little bit just to align themselves with the 20% increase that we had been making for UAP. But by and large, they're really close to being the same. And then we also put in place a special rule to streamline the regulations for 100% affordable projects. Next. So where can you find some of these UAP rules? In 1210 is where we created the term qualifying affordable housing, and that's an umbrella that includes UAP developments and MIH developments. And that's what we use in the FAR section, in the height and setback section, and many other sections as well. 2322 is the FAR section, and this is just one table that has a column for standard residences and another column for qualifying affordable, qualifying senior housing. Tried to really simplify it. It is not a bonus, it's just 2 different FARs. Height and setbacks regulations, they're in 23432, and again, just 2 separate columns, one applying to standard residences and one applying to qualifying affordable senior housing. And I'll show you these in a second. Height factor. So this is 23732. This is a clarification that there is no pathway generally to use UAP for sky exposure plane buildings. They're not compatible, and there's never really been a pathway for R6 to R9 districts to integrate with the affordable housing programs. So they were never part of IHDA generally or MIH, and they will continue to be that way. Frank will talk about some special residential parking regulations for affordable housing. And then he also mentioned at the beginning that we moved a lot of the administrative functions out of the bulk regulations into a separate chapter. So they don't have to bog down the FAR rules anymore. So in 2710, this is where you'll find the rules governing the administration of the UAP and MIH programs, and that includes all the different affordability rates. One more note on this is that UAP is a big deal. I've touched on a lot of the underlying residential rules, but we also had to kind of carry all these changes through special area rules like the waterfront, or also many different special districts. So sometimes we encountered very bespoke FARs or very bespoke height and setbacks, and we had to kind of reverse engineer a UAP FAR for them, and also reverse engineer a special height for them. Whenever we encounter that, we try to do that. So there's many instances where they might have one-off UAP FARs, but they have a UAP FAR. And so it's generally applicable across the board from all R6 to R12 districts. Next. And this is just showing kind of that new section organization. The FARs are on the left here, and you see just 2 different columns, one for standard residences, and then on the right, one for qualifying affordable housing or qualifying senior housing. And the same basic structure for the height section. You don't have to leaf through a bunch of different sections anymore. They're just side-by-side standard residences with a maximum base height and maximum overall height, and then a separate overall height and sometimes separate base height for qualifying affordable housing, qualifying senior housing. Next.
All right. So now we're gonna jump into parking and parking, right? So because it has effects in R1 through R10 districts, we thought it sort of made more sense to do as part of these, like, not in any individual like low density or medium high density, but something that's bigger. One thing I'd say as I jump into this, Chris, I've been trying to, like, and I know John was too, trying to go through questions in the chat. There's, I think, one or two on open space and permitted obstructions. I just wanted you to take a look at as I'll jump into parking. Thank you guys for actually having so many questions. This is good. This is like, I've never used this chat function, but it's actually more fun than I thought it would be. All right, so parking. So one of the big aspects of the project was to look at residential parking requirements in the city writ large, outside of Manhattan core and the LIC area, and maybe some sort of particular special district situations. There are parking requirements for residences in zoning districts. Wait, let's see what's here. Yeah, there it is. That's actually, I've tried to update this a little bit. So what CHO proposed and sort of as modified are a series of different geographies that exist outside of those areas that have outside of a Manhattan core and the LIC, where parking is going to be different than it was before. And I sort of maybe feels a little complicated, but generally falls into like three buckets of areas. The first is called in the zoning and sort of shown on the map, is the inner transit zone. So this is going to be the area in 9, 10, 11, CB's 9, 10, 11 Manhattan, and along the Brooklyn Queens waterfront. In those areas, generally, there is no longer a parking requirement for residences moving forward, right? So if you're building a new building, you do not have to provide parking if you don't want to. In the next geography, light bluish, is called the outer transit zone. And in this area, there are requirements, but they're much more reduced than what they previously had been in these places. They'll be based on zoning district. We'll show them in a sec. But in general, it represents a significant change from what the parking previously had been. And then in the area called, actually in the zoning, the beyond the greater transit zone. So this is going to be the area that's like grayish on this map. There are still requirements. They generally look like the requirements that existed previously, but there are some important distinctions, some slight adjustments to percentages and waivers that may be important sort of on an edge case, depending on the buildings. But generally those areas still have parking to a degree. There's also some special rules in some of these areas, trying to like work out different things for different types of buildings, usually those being proposed as part of CHO. So there's no parking in what I would call the outer transit zone or beyond the greater transit zone for any accessory dwelling unit or conversions, right? So if you're doing an accessory dwelling unit, you could be sort of Western Staten Island, not in the outer transit zone, and you still would not have a parking requirement for that unit. There's also no parking required for qualifying residential sites, those buildings we talked about in low density districts a little earlier, in the outer transit zone or beyond the greater transit zone, as long as the building up to 75 units. So it's a fairly large apartment building, depending on the locations. But that there's no parking required for buildings like that. There's no parking for affordable housing in the outer transit zone. And there's a pretty low requirement in the area and beyond the greater transit zone. And there are some geographies where the rules get a little bit more complicated, where even though they are in the outer transit zone, you follow the requirements for standard residences beyond the greater transit zone, but you follow the requirements for affordable housing of the outer transit zone itself. A little bit complicated, just usually really dealing with the rules that had been in place in some of these places for a while, even before CHO. Couple other things about residential parking sort of are important to keep in mind. Usually the zoning thinks about two types of parking. It thinks about permitted parking, and then it thinks about required parking. So permitted parking is you sort of look at your requirements and in fact you waived out, or the use didn't have parking requirements, or it could depend, but you still provided parking. That's permitted, right? It's not required, that's permitted. You could always remove that before CHO, you could always continue to remove that. But if you had required parking, and that was required when you were doing the building, you can't remove that because you're now in an area where all of a sudden the zoning says a new building doesn't have a parking requirement. Can't do that as of right. There's one sort of, what do you call this? Exemption from that, which is if you're in that inner transit zone, that sort of northern Manhattan, eastern or the sort of East River parts of Brooklyn and Queens. If you're a single and two family house, you are allowed to remove any parking that had been previously required. So it's a small thing, but it can be important on a site in that case. Anywhere else is going to require essentially coming to the City Planning Commission to remove previously required parking. So if you're in the outer transit zone, if you're in the inner transit zone outside of a single or two family house, it would be a CPC authorization. You would go to 7531 for that. Anywhere else, it's going to be a City Planning Commission special permit, and you would go to 7452 for that. There are some tables that we've tried to provide, even in the inner transit zone. There are questions about just like, you could be in a situation where the building was built 60 years ago. You may not have the drawings. You may not have any of the details about it. There's a chart that tries to help make this easier if you're in those situations, to try to clean that up. Another thing that's important in the inner transit zone is any residential parking can be used as public parking. And particularly what that means in zoning speak is it can be rented for any period of time. That is comparable to rules that exist in the Manhattan core, where any parking can actually be turned into public parking, and tries to maintain that same concept in these places where there no longer is a parking requirement. In places beyond that inner transit zone, residential parking can be rented for periods of between a week and a month. So it still allows for others to rent the spaces, just not in that sort of more flexible time period. And then another thing, and there's actually a question in the chat about one of this. In a lot of the lower density districts, there were floor area exemptions that existed for parking that were often melted our brains, that were sort of created over time as different districts were created. And we tried to simplify that a little bit by bringing them all into line in a single exemption that tries to sort of cut across all the districts equally. So when you're in those places that have residential parking requirements, outer transit zone or beyond the greater transit zone, much of the rules are going to be really located in these two charts. They will show column A is per the different zoning districts. Column A is going to show parking requirements for standard units. And then column B is often going to show parking requirements for various forms of housing, essentially that don't have a requirement. So that could be like affordable housing, that could be like an ancillary dwelling unit. And then column C is going to be your waivers, right? So similar to the way it worked before, you would calculate your requirements and then you would check if you're under the waiver thresholds. And if you are, you don't have a parking requirement. That same concept still exists. It's just more in chart form, hopefully a little bit simpler. It often was kind of hard to like read through all the sections to like find out all of a sudden you didn't have a parking requirement. This tries to like bring it all into one section. Same concept in beyond the greater transit zone. But the numbers are different, right? The requirements are going to be different from the outer transit zone. So it's a separate chart, some different situations there. And you follow the rules then there with that same concept in mind. To give an example, one of the ones we often use is like an R6 district. In the outer transit zone, an R6 district, for simplicity, had a 50% parking requirement. It was quality housing. And a 5-space waiver. And what that meant was like typically at like a 10-ish unit building would be able to exempt itself out of parking. In the outer transit zone today, a parking requirement is no longer 50%, it's now 25%, so that's a cut. But then importantly, the waivers actually increased too from 5 spaces to 15. And so when you do that math, essentially means like a 60-unit building is exempt from parking in that outer transit zone. So larger buildings still going to have a requirement, but smaller buildings, and it's different in different zoning districts. The higher the density, the higher the amount of units that would be exempted. But the numbers are just very different from what they had been previously, even in those areas. So residential parking, again, a lot of this is going to be found first in the definitions that show those geographies, the greater transit zone, the inner transit zone, and the outer transit zone. Then floor area, right? Those locations for floor area exemptions for accessory parking, all going to be located now in one place. There were some changes. I sort of don't talk about these because they were sort of in the background, but there were some tweaks to some of the just rules of the Manhattan core and the LIC area that sort of we've been looking to do over time. They are also made sort of, they are parking related, but they are not in those kind of bigger transit zone areas. And then the parking rules themselves. So you're going to be in parking. So 25, Article 2, Chapter 5. In 21 will be the rules for the inner transit zone, essentially where there is no parking requirement for new construction. 25, 22 is the outer transit zone. And then 25, 23, the rest of the, essentially the rest of the city and the rules there. Those rules about like how parking spaces can be used, they're going to be in 25, 41. Those rules about like rental of spaces, stuff like that. So that's residential parking. And one of the things that like that of course, if you followed the press or anything, that was definitely one of the bigger items in the project. There were a couple tweaks to, let's call it non-residential parking, but sort of adjacent to the project as a whole. So two things here really. Number one, parking is no longer required for houses of worship anywhere in the city. So in low density districts, you often had a parking, you could have had a parking requirement for a house of worship. Higher, medium and high density districts, you didn't, but at least in the R1s or R5s, you did. There no longer is a parking requirement for houses of worship. That plays through, not just in residential districts, but it also plays through in commercial and manufacturing districts equally. The other thing kind of important, one of the things that I think we showed early on was that mixed building that had ground floor commercial and then residential above it. One of the things that actually borrowing rules that had existed in places like Special Inwood District, but also maybe even more importantly, all of Staten Island. There's an allowance that if you're doing a mixed development, so that includes housing and other non-residential use, depending on where you are in those parking geographies and depending on your lot size, you're able to waive the non-residential requirements up for parking for those uses. You may still have a requirement for the residential, but it'll at least allows the ground floor commercial or community facility like spaces to ensure that you don't have a requirement there. That is parking. I'm gonna turn it back over to Chris and I'll jump back onto the chat in a sec. Yeah.
Sounds good. So this is our last section, and it's really not as thematically strong as the other ones. This is sort of our grab bag of other provisions that we amended in the process. Next. So starting off, I wanted to talk about the old quality housing program elements. So as you probably all recall, in 2800, there was a sort of a grab bag of different things that were great things that were trying to get folks to build better quality buildings, as the name suggests. And it oftentimes gave floor area exemptions for providing good corridors with lots of light, or having a limited number of units opening onto the corridor, or for providing recreation space or laundry space or trash rooms. They were great at the time. They were established in the 1980s, and the only issues with them are that it only applied to quality housing buildings and not to any other multifamily housing buildings. And two, they were a little bit old and obsolete, and we wanted to modernize them and update them to reflect the current needs of buildings. So the first thing that we did was we expanded the allowances to all multifamily buildings, so that everyone throughout the city can take advantage of them. And then we tried to make some of the rules more flexible. The first thing we did was just give a flat 5% floor area deduction for amenities. You all can decide what those amenities should be, given the type of building and the clientele that you want to have inside the building. Maybe it's a book room or a library or a music room, or in other places it might be a package room and laundry rooms. Or all of the above. I mean, it's everyone can have the decision points now, but everyone's capped at 5%. So it just kind of lets give people more options, more choice. We kept the corridor deductions, and we just tried to modernize them a little bit and change some of the optionalities with them. So for instance, we wanted to give options to providing light in corridors. So it doesn't always have to be a window. It could be a window in a stairwell. It could be another scenario. And then we also tweaked the density rule to be more about corridor length and trying to minimize really long corridors, because we do want to facilitate corridors with lots of rooms. It's just we don't want to have a really long corridor. So that was the tweak to that, and we also updated the trash rules to be a percentage of relate to a percentage of the number of units within the building, and allow that to be aggregated in one spot or dispersed through the building instead of just 12 feet on every single floor. So you'll find those updates. You'll find the exemptions in 2323, and then you'll find the recreation space requirement that is kind of borrowed from the old rule in 2363. Next. The next change is to conversions. This change is kind of two-pronged. First, we were updating the rules of Article 1, Chapter 5 that allow you to convert buildings, non-residential buildings, into residences. We were changing the geography, so the eligible applicabilities to the entire city. So rather than just being a sort of south of Central Park and sort of inner ring Queens and Brooklyn rule, it's now a citywide rule. Second, we changed the date of eligible buildings. So previously, it generally had only been applicable to buildings that were constructed before 1961. We changed the date up to 1991. So buildings constructed before 1991 are now eligible to convert and use the provisions of Article 1, Chapter 5. Next. The Landmark Transfer Development Rights Program also has kind of two core changes to it. Similarly, in the realm of geographic expansion as well as process change. So first, the process change is that previously this had been a City Planning Commission special permit, and we have tried to make just the transfer itself a chair cert. So it should be much more streamlined, much easier. Second, the change is to the eligible receiving lights from the landmark. Formerly, you were eligible to be a receiving lot if you were adjacent to the landmark, across the street from the landmark, or catty corner on the intersection from the landmark, which is what the top right diagram is showing. Now you can be any lot on the same block as the landmark, as well as any lot across the street from that block, or catty corner from that block. So you can see it really opens up the eligible geography quite a bit. So we're excited about that. just a side note that if you need bulk changes associated with this, there is an authorization for that, or if you need transfers beyond 30% in the highest density districts, there is the special permit remaining for that at 7479. Next. Non-compliances. So there's a couple things that we wanted to do that we were excited about, was to open up some possibilities for folks to create new or increase existing non-compliances. We didn't want to really open this up a whole bunch, but nonetheless, we were really keen to do something because we know that because so much of our building stock is old and obsolete and needs some real improvements done, we knew that we needed to make some targeted ways for folks to have as of right ways to update and modernize their buildings. So the first thing that we did in 5452 was to create a way for folks to improve their accessibility of their building or improve their safety. And so if you're going to, if you wanted to add an elevator to your building, you would now be able to add that elevator and potentially increase your permitted overall FAR, even if you're overbuilt, or increase your overall height, or put an obstruction in a court. For all of those things, you're now allowed to increase an existing non-compliances, provided that it doesn't exceed targeted volumetric parameters. So we have, maximum heights on what that can exceed, maximum floor area that you can use to do that, maximum amounts of space that you can obstruct in a yard. But nonetheless, it's meant to really try to give some real meaningful paths so that folks don't have to, seek a variance or seek a special permit, just to do really reasonable things and update their buildings. The next pathway that we created was for residential retrofits. We wanted to kind of go above and beyond for residential retrofits. And here, basically, the idea is very similar. The caveat to the FAR is that you can't exceed the volume of the existing building. So if you had room in a rear yard, you could potentially take your garage and reoccupy that garage, change it from space that was not floor area into space that is floor area. And we think that's a great thing. Similar in a high density context, you might be moving mechanical space onto a ceiling or something like that, and in that freed up space, if you would formerly have been overbuilt and couldn't really do much with that space, now you could put a dwelling unit within that space. So we tried to make some meaningful paths to just, change their buildings, but also increase residences across the board. If those as of right paths are not enough, we also created an authorization in 7523 that allows even greater mods through the CPC. Next. A couple of change, or one singular change to split lots. In the FAR calculation of split lot rules, historically, the way that you had calculated it is that you take the percentage of the lot in the high density district, take the percentage of the lot in the low density district, come up with an adjusted FAR, and then each portion of the zoning lot could not exceed the district FAR or the adjusted, whichever is higher. And so in effect, what that meant was that folks would swoosh down their FAR from the high density portion to the low density portion. We tried to invert that a little bit. There was already a couple of exceptions to that, and we tried to broaden that rule and give it to everyone. So now going forward, you can increase your high density portion if it's on a wide street by up to 20% over the district max. And we think that's a good idea. It's a practical idea because it allows you to concentrate density on the wide streets and in sort of the higher density places that are better equipped to handle the density. It's shifting it off the mid block. Next. Railroad right-of-ways. So this is also in the spirit of process reform. We, for many of you, railroad right-of-ways is a source of pain and agony, and it has been for us as well. And so what we try to do is create some targeted pathways for folks to not have to always get a special permit. I'm on the next slide, Frank. Thank you. We try to create some targeted pathways for folks to not have to always seek that special permit. So we have a certification for if you are a small lot with an abandoned right of way, and so hopefully that'll be for those targeted instances where you're not trying to utilize FAR from the railroad, you're just trying to do a small development on a small lot. you don't have to be subject to the whole rigmarole of a special permit. Next. We created new districts. The higher density districts have gotten a lot of attention. The R11s, the R12s that are going to 12 and 15 FAR respectively. There are non-contextual and contextual variants of both of them, as well as C4 and C6 commercial equivalents for both of them. We also created a sort of mid-density new district, R6D and R62, contextual and non-contextual. These will have 3 FAR for an MIH FAR. So it's trying to kind of span the gap between R6B and R6A. It's kind of a pretty broad difference between the two. So this kind of plugs that gap and gives you something in the middle. So some new districts at the high end, some new districts in the medium end. Next. We also have a few new actions. We tried to kind of go through and comb through the special permits, take some out that were maybe no longer necessary, like a special permit for swimming pools. There was a special permit for house of worship to reduce house of worship parking. That's no longer necessary. It's obsolete. We also tried to consolidate some special permits together, make a singular special permit, for example, for irregular sites. So that special permit's in 7495. Next. We talked a lot about changes to underlying rules, but as we've both mentioned before, a lot of this, we tried to take the spirit of all these changes and carry them through a lot of the special districts and special areas of the ZR. So this is just sort of a reminder that, some of the special district rules might have changed as well, or probably did change. Next. And then lastly, this is just a reminder that we did create special vesting rules. If CHO isn't to your liking and you are, far along in the process beforehand and you don't really want to go to the trouble of changing all your drawings or updating everything, applications that are filed at DOB before December 5th, 2024, under the previous rules, if DOB approves that within 1 year, you continue under the old rules. They can be vested and continue pursuant to those regulations. Next. And that is it.
All right. So I think now what we're going to do is open up the raise hand function. So if anyone would like to come on and ask a question live, we can promote you. We have, about a half hour left in the session. So please feel free to use the raise hand function. And thanks so much, everyone, for interacting so much in the chat. I'm going to promote Jeffrey. Jeffrey, you should be allowed to turn on your video and unmute. Jeffrey, I don't think we're hearing you. You might have to adjust your audio settings. I'm sorry, Jeffrey, we're still not hearing you. Jeffrey, we're still not hearing you. I'm gonna bring you back down and maybe put your question in the Q&A box. But I can bring you back up if um, if you can solve your audio issues. Okay, I'm gonna bring Mark up. Hi, Mark, you should be able to unmute. Mark, are you?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you. So am I to understand in an R32 district outside the transit zone at this point, a two-family residence would require 0 parking, off-street parking spaces?
Two family, outer transit zone?
Yes, beyond the transit zone.
Looks
A
like it's
normal
got a
Staten Island,
50%
a normal
requirement.
Staten Island residence.
Yeah, it looks like if you go to the parking regs 25-232, that's requirements for developments or enlargements beyond the greater transit zone. R32 has a 50% requirement and a 1 spot maximum waiver. So that would get you to
0.
you could waive out entirely a parking.
It's a 0. So if I was to design a two-family house in an R32 district, I would require 0 parking spaces.
You could put it in there, and we expect that, in that situation, most developers would want to put at least a spot, maybe 2, but the zoning would not require it.
Right, so a lot of residences in Staten Island have taken their garages and converted them, converted them into whatever, family rooms, playrooms. Would they now be legal and not require that garage space?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Frank and Chris. I believe that council modifications at the end of the process imposed a process on even 1 or 2 family homeowners to remove existing parking requirements. And so while it's pretty onerous for a one or 2 family homeowner to go through, they would require an authorization in order to remove that any existing parking requirement that goes to the community boards and then goes to the city planning commission. And it's technically a discretionary action that you have to check a little environmental review box. Presumably it would be type 2, wouldn't require environmental review, but that's not automatic.
Right, so if I design something new, they would not be required parking, but if somebody removed the parking from an older established two-family house, they'd have to go through the process.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. If you're in the inner transit zone, you could remove it, but that is a limited area. But that was a council modification. That's correct.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna try to see if Jeffrey can come back on again. Jeffrey, are you able to?
Are you hearing me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry about the snafu before. 2 questions, and I apologize, just a little technical problem on my side earlier. The asterisk, the footnote in the floor area regulations for I think it's 2321 indicate a one-family dwelling is limited to 60%. For one dwelling unit on a lot exceeding 4,000 square feet is limited to 60%. If I design a one-family dwelling, does that mean I don't get a house that's 0.75 at that point?
That's right. That like in those places, if you're doing, you can get to those higher numbers if you're doing, say it's a single family district, say you're doing an ancillary dwelling unit, or if it's like a 2-family district and you had access to a second unit anyway, you can get it for that too.
Okay, so I got a 4,001 square foot lot. I'm going to put a one-family dwelling. It's 0.6.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, all right. So now take that. I've got a single family, I got a 4,001 square foot lot. I'm gonna put a two family, it's 0.75. My limit, let's say I couldn't do, uh, a, my one dwelling unit is limited to 60% in
That's
that
right.
case as well, right?
That's it, right, that's right. Like essentially like, it is just saying that single, Chris, correct me if I get this wrong, but it's like essentially that single unit can be no bigger than that 0.6.
Understood.
But yeah.
Understood. The second question I have, what we used to have, 54313, if you wanted to do enlargements to a non-complying building. And, the new section is not very, well, I have not found it to be very clear on what you can do. Can we, used to be you had to be 3 feet from the neighbor. That looks like that's, sorry, 3 feet from a lot line, looks like that's out. You had to be 8 feet from a neighbor, looks like that's gone. But then it gets sort of vague on what you can add from there. Can you provide some clarity on that? I think the new section is 5354.
54, 53.
Sorry,
No, it's fine.
little dyslexic in the cup.
No, it's fine. Really the limitations, I think, in terms of what you can do in a yard are in paragraph B there. That they cannot diminish the area of the existing open area by more than 20%, and that you can't, no further encroachment can be closer to a lot line than an existing building on the zoning lot. So if you have a garage at 3 feet, you couldn't encroach closer than that garage. You can prolong the garage, but you can't go closer than that garage.
Right.
In this example.
That's the rub. So let's say I got a house, I got a 20 foot, 20 foot wide lot. I've, in an R3 zone, and I have, 2 foot side yards. Okay.
Yeah.
That doesn't conform to anything. I could go straight up with that. Correct?
Yep.
Okay. I got that. But it looks like I can, and let's say I've got a 200-foot deep lot. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah.
And my house and my building's in the middle. And I want to extend out the front and out the back because I've got lots of room. And I want to keep that 2 foot side yard. I can do that, couldn't I?
Yeah.
Okay. Then it sort of seems to say I'm limited to 1 story or 15 feet. Am I reading that correctly? That my extension out the front and back is limited to 1 story?
I think we need to clarify that. So that paragraph C is meant to be, if you say you're in a medium or high density district and you're wanting to go up, that height limitation cannot exceed 1 story or 15 feet.
Oh, so that's like I'm gonna add, okay, that's so there were
That's
2
like
ways to
adding
read
a
it. Okay,
up
so
top.
I'm gonna put a second floor on my 1 story building. Terrific. I
Yeah.
want to extend out the back. I'm gonna do the 2 story dance. Great. Out the front, as long as I got my yards in my front yard, my rear yard, I can do that as well. I'm not limited to a 1 story extension.
I don't think so. Frank and I will take a look at it, and this has come up before, and we'd have to make a clarification on this
Oh, great.
or
I
dynamic.
appreciate that.
Yeah, we're going to work on that.
Now, there used to be a section of zoning for Staten Island specific where you had ground floor uses in commercial zones, where the first 30 feet of a building had to be commercial, depending on if you were in a primary street, secondary street, tertiary street. You've removed that, and it looks like you've created some language about tier 1, like tier A, tier B, and tier C. I'm really unclear on what those tiers are. If A is a not B or a C, so then I'm trying to figure out what a B and C is. You follow what I'm?
Yes.
Okay.
So this wasn't housing that did this. This was zoning for economic opportunity. The definitions of what it means to be a tier B and tier C frontage are in 32-301. Tier B just means that you are within a C1, C2 district, C4 through C7, M1 district in a special streetscape area. That generally is referring to the old transit zone. So if you're in the Appendix I transit zone, or in Manhattan core or in LIC area, then you are in the special streetscape area. If you're beyond that, then you're generally tier A. Unless you are a specially designated street. So tier C, we think of as like a special purpose district will have, a map in the back of the appendix and say, these are the tier C streets. And this is also what happened to the special Staten Island rules, is though those primary streets became tier C streets.
Tier C, like Charlie.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll look at the, I didn't notice any of the map changes in SRD. And I did for this particular exercise, this job that I have is in specific South Richmond district. I'm just trying to figure out if my ground floor can go residential, then, I got to look at it that way. Okay.
There's
hope,
special rules in the end of 3230. I think it's 3235 specifically that has a rule for Staten Island.
3230. Oh, there is? Oh, all right. Well, I'll check that out. 3235. I appreciate
It's
your time.
really hard to get there on the online ZR. This is like the glitchiest piece of the.
Yes, I was saying that. It
Yeah.
skips. I was talking to somebody. He said I was crazy.
I'm
I think
trying
he's on the
to
line.
find it
Crazy.
for you, but it's just like it's not happening.
I feel like Chris and I have been like, as we're trying to answer questions in the chat, like I think we've somehow broken the online ZR because we're like zooming back and forth between sections. And I also am having some trouble with that.
Yeah, it skips. You can't.
Yeah,
See it.
we are aware of the skip and we are looking to figure out what the heck happened. We think it has been caused by the fact that we've sort of reshuffled all the zoning resolution in the last two projects. But somehow particularly CHO caused this more. And so we are trying to figure out what's going on. And you are not alone in finding that frustrating.
Oh, one last thing, if I could circle back to that 0.6 footnote.
Yeah.
The footnote changed from the 12.5 version to now, I think, I don't know when it was changed, which is odd because that it went from 4,000 to exceeds at least 4,000 to exceeds 4,000. And I don't know that it affects any projects that I have specifically, but there isn't a date change noted associated in that section with that footnote change.
So when corrections are done to the zoning, the date at the top of the section doesn't change. Those dates are meant for historical purposes to just be there for when a full-on zoning text change happened, text amendment.
Oh, that's a correction.
That is a correction. It was a thing that was noticed by the city council that their intended change. They were, just for full disclosure, the change from 0.6 to 0.75, or the change from essentially 0.75 to 0.6 was made by the city council, and their specific change was not represented in the original version that was approved on 12.5. That was not what they intended. When they noticed it, I think it was essentially when the online ZR went up fully, they contacted the department and we had to address because essentially the text was not reflecting their intent.
So it was a correction on amendment. Oh boy.
That's correct.
I hope that doesn't affect anybody's filings.
Yes, I mean it's these early times after text, especially honestly something this big, we acknowledge it becomes hard on people. I just fully, and I think it's only in situations where the text is something is obviously broken or it did not reflect typically the council's intent. We try not to do those things much because we try to get the text correct during the public review process. But this was one where the change they wanted was not what actually got into the text.
Well, kudos to you guys for getting it all done in a timely manner. And whoever picked that up, thank goodness it didn't stick in there for a year or so. I appreciate all the efforts.
We acknowledge, thanks, actually. We acknowledge there are people who may have been in tougher situations because of that, but that is, we have to play by the rules. The rules are, the council wanted to make that the council's approval is what mattered, and that was not what they intended, so that's why it was changed.
All right.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm going to bring up Emily for her question. One moment. And then if no one else raises their hands, we can maybe do some more in the chat. Hi, Emily, you should be able to unmute.
All right, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Yep.
I have a question. If you have a building that was 2 floors were built, you want to do a conversion, and you have two floors built prior to 1991, and then you add 3 floors after. Can you convert the whole building?
Sorry, I'm just assuming the 3 floors were also say non-res.
Right, the whole building is non-residential.
It's a good question. My guess would say you cannot, but I would also assume the specifics of that filing and everything would come into play. Chris, does that feel right to you?
I just one note that the first line of 1501 says conversions in buildings or portions thereof existing
Yeah.
on December 31st, 1990.
Yeah, right. That like I think it sort of assuming this building exists, right? Like you could do the 2 floors and use Article 1, Chapter 5. The top floor, I'm assuming they're on the top, but like the 3 floors, I'll say,
Right.
May not be able to use Article 1, Chapter 5. I mean, I guess the other thing to consider is like, the other option outside of Article 1, Chapter 5 is if you are, if you could comply with residential bulk, you could do it, right? And maybe, I don't know what the situation is, but that may be a path for some amount of it to convert.
Okay, but the language or portions thereof wouldn't kind of grandfather or get you in to convert the posts.
That's
Well,
right. That's right.
Okay. All right, thanks. I mean, if I wanted to, could I get a pre-con from DOB on that? Would that where I'd go?
Yes, that's right. I mean, one of the, I say this, Emily, for your question. One of the things, there've been a couple of questions in the chat, that, our answers are, it's going to depend on DOB, and that's true of most of this, right? Like, the specifics of the case, the specifics of the lot, the situation, they're the arbiters. They regulate the zoning. We just sort of write it and stuff. So I think that you'd have to go to them for that.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Thank you, Emily. Okay, we've got a couple more folks. I'm promoting Charles. Charles, you should be able to unmute.
Hello.
Hi.
So I just got a question based on the one that just was asked. So would the retrofit text that allows for changes within the for new non-compliances within the existing volume of a building in the case of a conversion allow for basically restacking floors there to increase floor area? So assuming you have a 3-story building, 45 feet tall. I demolish the top 2 stories out of those 3, and I restack it into 4. Would that be a permitted increase in non-compliance within the bulk of the existing non-residential building?
Wait, it's a non-residential building?
Yeah, so like an Article 1, Chapter 5 eligible building.
Oh.
I think you're talking about 54, 53, Charles?
Yep.
I think that's only eligible if the building is 75% or more of its existing floor space is residential.
I thought that it was if you're converting it to be 75% or more. It's a non-resident, it's a retrofit, right? You're going from commercial to.
I think the idea is you're going from residential to maybe a little bit more residential. You're updating your building, you're changing your mechanicals, or you're making an ADU in the back. It's not meant to be an alternate path to get around Article 1, Chapter 5. The language, it says for buildings where 75% or more of the existing floor space is allocated to residential use, then the enlargement, extension, conversion, change of use, or other alteration may create a new noncompliance or increase the degree of noncompliance. I think you have to have an existing building with 75% that is residential. Does that make sense?
So then I could effectively, could I do a two-phase then in that situation? That's playful. I mean, I could do an Article 1, Chapter 5 conversion and then do a subsequent alteration using this.
There are limits on that, like
Yeah.
in paragraph A, the building has to exist on December 5th, so it's not a complete free for all.
Gotcha.
But there are some parameters in B and C that you probably could. Yeah.
All right, that makes sense.
We tried to put the floor area part under, more safety glass.
No, that's super fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. I'm going to promote Stan. Stan, you should be able to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, just so you know, it kind of window pops up and it turns, and then it asks us to unmute. So it does take a couple of seconds.
Yeah, it takes a sec.
So with regards to, I have a large site on Staten Island. It's an R32 district, but it's outside of the greater transit zone. So the question is an R32 large site an eligible site under UAP? Because it appears that starts at like R6 and up.
That's correct.
All right, so there is nothing for the R32, R4, R5 if you're a large site, even if you wanted to do qualifying senior housing or so on.
Well, so maybe two things, Stan. So, if you're in an R32, you have the ability to do affordable senior housing, and there are different FARs, and you essentially become a qualifying residential site for that use. That it's sort of mimicking what was available before CHO for affordable senior and kind of like long-term care stuff.
Right.
If you really are a large site or 3.2, you're generating like 50,000 square feet. If the lot could generate 50,000 square feet of residential floor area, there are there's like an additional condition on maxing out the full qualifying residential floor area, which is it's essentially an affordability requirement for 20% of the housing on the lot. But depends on the lot size, and how you may be splitting it up into different lots and things like that. But you may have that kick in, or you may not.
So the structuring of that type of project would be something that I would have to line up and qualify to the Department of Buildings so that they understand where we're grabbing all these sections from.
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, and sort of just I've been trying on the chat. I think the R3A, R3X thing just would want to let's connect, after, to talk through some of that.
Sure, sure. I think the more important one is the 300 square foot garage.
Yeah, understood on that. And that is, it's interesting because it's like, no one noticed it in public review. It sort of just stayed throughout the whole project.
I am
But it
embarrassed
does
myself.
confuse everyone. Yeah, no, it is an issue that like does not feel as if it's doing something way more than the text was trying to do.
Great, great. I'm glad to hear it's being worked on. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Frank, did you mention that for large
Oh.
sites in low density districts, they do get an extra height bump?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
There's an additional sorry.
Yeah, so Stan, there's in 23425, there's a provision that allows large sites to get an additional, basically you get the qualifying residential site height, if you're in a multifamily district. And then you also get an additional 10 feet on top of that, just to acknowledge that you're contending with a lot of open space.
See, but it's interesting because even under a qualifying residential site, if you go to 342, it's 35 for the maximum base height and 35 for the maximum height. So where is that extra 10 coming from? In what section?
23425. It's the paragraph B. It lets you increase it by 10 feet.
All right, great. Thank you for the guidance.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. We don't currently have anyone else raising their hand in the chat. Frank and Chris, maybe before we close, do you want to run through anything just out loud?
Yeah, let me, I'm just trying to make sure. Trying to see if there are ones that haven't come up as topics. Can you, Chris, the 233414.2, I think that's the non-ancillary dwelling unit yard allowance, right?
Like the permitted
obstructions.
Yeah,
that's right. So there is we're sort of doing this off memory now because we're having so much trouble on the online ZR. But that is, so there's the one right above it that is about ancillary dwelling units. And then there's the one below it, and it's a bit more flexible for permitted obstructions. It's meant for sort of the other types of construction that you're able to do. That is part of a house or something else. The parking for affordable housing. So this is kind of a question that comes up in depending on, well, actually, Alex would like to answer this question. So if you are in places where, so if you're in the inner transit zone or the outer transit zone, the affordable parking number is shown as 0. It is, depending on the form of housing that you had, that was built and the type of affordable housing that it was, it may not have had a parking requirement. It may have had a very low parking requirement and would have waived. And so there are situations where the 0 is really there trying to reflect the reality that was true before CHO. That may be possible, that there are situations where, because the site does actually, the 0 is there, it waves out, but it may have waved out before too. Can you note or show one of those corrections? Let's see. Probably in Florida. Let's see if we can get there. 23.
2321. It's right there.
Do you see it?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you do. Last amended. The little black box above, recently corrected.
Oh, but Frank, you're not showing that screen if you.
Oh, you want to actually show it in?
Oh, I don't know.
Actually, you know what I'll do? I'll put a link to that question. Type answer. So it's sort of everyone can see it. It just given, apologies right now, just as I'm trying to like look up lots of zoning things, it may just be easier for me to not try to share another screen. The whole thing will collapse. People planning to build for a large family that might require more than 2,400 square feet full area. Just included. I think, Robert, it's the same question. This is a question about the 0.6 FAR and the lower densities. I think sort of the answer I think that would be out there is like before CHO, at least I think in most of these districts, the max FAR is 0.5. You may have had access to the attic bonus in some of the districts. And that could have gotten you up to 0.6. This just sort of gives you the 0.6 without a requirement that it be under a roof and all that. There is the exemption for parking that's sort of also there too. And that I think the idea is in general, those things are sort of meant to like keep people whole from what they were previously. I would say also just sort of in full disclosure, that would the kind of change, I think I said this before, the change from 0.75 to 0.6 was a council change. And so we are doing our best to like describe the council's intent here. But that was not as say sort of part of the thing that city planning originally referred out, but that's the change they made. It says you can convert from non-residential to residential, even if it has a non-residential design. Yeah, I think I'm seeing the question about the non-residential use. I think, and every building is going to be different, but like I think the general idea is, you have your residential world of floor area and that you have your community facility, commercial, manufacturing. And I think if it's in that's going to be your non-residential bucket. But if you have space that like is sort of part of the residential structure, it would be under the R. Right, okay, black box is there. Thank you for this. It appears zero lot line are now permitted in South Richmond. They may be. That may be true. Yeah. I'd have to. Just honestly, I'd have to look at that one. So maybe, just because we have to look at South Richmond at the same time.
Frank, maybe we can follow up with.
Yeah.
You kind of on this one.
Did I hear correctly? Landlord. Misunderstand. Wait, that go. Chris, on the residential non-compliance, 75% of the building needs to be residential. That's right. And the idea of that is it's sort of meant for buildings that are like residential, to take that on.
Yeah, we weren't trying to create a shadow Article 1, Chapter 5.
I think also Stan had a question about the waivers, and I just to say this, like, I know we're all used to like a parking section that has a floor, like it has the percentages, and then you follow in like later sections, and all of a sudden you find like these waivers that like are amazing. One of the things we tried to do was simplify that a little and put them all in the same section. So those charts have the parking charts. They have the waivers right there. There are a couple of footnotes to them that like mainly reflect existing or pre-existing rules that sort of play into it. But those things are all in those charts in really 25-22 for the outer transit zone and 25-23 for beyond the greater transit zone.
Column C is the waiver.
Oh yeah, well, it's at least in 25-22. I think there's a couple more columns in 23, but it's the one on the right. It's always the end one. Writing an increase in the number permitted number. Permitted parking for mixed development. I mean, you're always allowed permitted parking up to the the 150s / 225s. That are in like 2510, and then the different the commercial and the M's have different ones. So there's those, but there's nothing more than that. I maybe I'm not getting the question, but if those outside of like conditions where you generated a requirement for a large number of spaces just by what you were building, um, those essentially now the 150 and the 225 control. And Stan says thank you. I don't, and I apologize if as we're trying to scan through this list, if there's a question I missed, either if you wanted, either send it again and just because we're trying to do this on the fly. But I thought we got to everything, either as we were just going now or before, but maybe there's something I'm missing.
Yeah. I'm
but yeah.
seeing one from
Oh.
Jacqueline, and then
that was his name.
Chris is raising his hand. Would you like me to promote him? I also know that we're past 5, Frank, so.
That's I mean, I think if maybe if it's okay by everyone's, maybe I'll say 2 things. Maybe let's promote Chris. I'll look at this question in the chat. I would also acknowledge, I think we're one of the things that's on this, I think still on this presentation right now, is the email address at the bottom. If you guys have questions, we are, as you can tell, we are really trying to like figure out and be helpful to everybody. And also, honestly, there are times we get questions and we're like, this is a question, or this is an issue, or something's getting transcribed wrong, or something. So please email, and we are here and we continue to answer those questions.
Chris.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I know there was a very specific question regarding parking on Staten Island, which is a very sensitive issue. And I think the question was asked about the outer transit zone. Okay, so let's get specific on Staten Island. We're in an R3X zone with a 2-family house proposed. It says that we have to provide 50% of the standard dwelling unit, right? Which would get us to 1 parking space, correct? Now, I believe that I heard you say that we could waive it down to 0, but if I look at the waiver, it says the waiver is 0 to footnote 3. That's only for zoning lots on existing December 5th, 2024, with the lot width of 25 feet or less. So on a standard lot on Staten Island, on a 40 by 100, we're not waiving anything out. And I think it was misinterpreted with the question before that we're going to 0, but we're not. Is that correct?
I think if oh, Chris, you
Oh, I thought the previous one might have been R3 too.
Yeah, I thought that was right.
If you're saying R3X, that they are different.
Yeah, different situation in that case. Okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
I was able to, now that the chat has calmed down a little bit, I've been able to go back to this page. So yeah, R32, it does have a waiver. It has the 1 space. The 2-family districts.
Yeah, the charts are very clear. So it's just the way the question maybe was asked, maybe
Yeah,
I answered it correctly or whatever, but certainly that's something that, I just wanted to raise my hand and just clarify it. Frank, I don't think we hear you any longer.
No, I'm sorry. I'm looking at a question. Jacqueline, I see your question. I think so. Chris and I hopefully know the zoning, or know our best, or tried our best. Jacqueline, I think John Mangan, who was on a little bit before, he had to leave a little bit earlier. I think that just given the specifics of it about affordable housing and the specifics about vesting and stuff like that, I think it's best to email that housing opportunity. Actually, I have it on the screen now. Housing opportunity at planning.nyc.gov for John to be able to take a look at it. Just to, I don't want to give you the wrong answer. Cool. I hope that was all helpful. It's a lot of zoning. Even in doing this, like we've had to like try to like simplify. So, we're not showing like 300 slides. But we hope it is helpful to like have a little bit of sense. It's great seeing the questions too, because like it's clear you all are using it. You're like in it, and hopefully you're finding it good, at least in some aspects, or in most aspects. And we'll take a look at anything else that comes up as you go through it.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it. There are a couple follow-ups. We'll make sure to email you. And thanks again and have a nice evening.
Bye, everybody.